The forest had become Ilara's sanctuary, and her prison all at once. A sprawling wilderness of ancient oaks and whispering pines that stretched endlessly beyond the borders of civilized wolf territory. She moved through the undergrowth with the quiet grace of someone who had learned to become part of the landscape itself, her feet barely disturbing the carpet of fallen leaves as she gathered moon-petal flowers from the shadowed glen where they bloomed in defiance of the season. 3 years had passed since the day her own pack had cast her out. 3 years since Alpha Garrick had stood before the assembled clan and declared her worthless, barren, a stain upon their bloodline that needed to be removed. She could still remember the weight of their stares, the mixture of pity and disgust in eyes that had once looked upon her with at least a measure of basic respect. Could still feel the phantom pain of the silver collar they had clamped around her neck to suppress her wolf before, dragging her beyond the territory markers and leaving her to whatever fate the wild lands would bring. They had expected her to die, of course. Most banished wolves did, especially those stripped of their connection to their inner beasts, left vulnerable to the rogues and predators that prowled these forgotten places. But Ilara had discovered something in her desperation to survive, something that whispered to her in the rustle of leaves and the babbling of hidden springs, an ancient power that thrummed beneath the soil and sang in the silver light of the moon. The forest had spoken to her in ways her pack never had, teaching her which roots could heal fever, which bark could knit broken bones, which flowers held the essence of pure moonlight in their delicate petals. Her hands had begun to glow with a soft radiance when she worked her healing, a phenomenon she didn't fully understand, but had learned to trust. And slowly the silver collar had weakened and fallen away. Her wolf, returning not with the savage fury she'd expected, but with a quiet, ancient knowing that felt nothing like the beast she'd known before. She had built a life here in the spaces between territories, in the lands that the packs had deemed too wild or too tainted by old magic to claim. Rogues occasionally stumbled into her path, wounded and desperate, and she healed them when she could, asking nothing in return except that they spread no word of her existence. A small cottage had grown around her, over the months, woven from living wood that bent to her touch, its walls breathing with the same gentle pulse as the forest itself. She had everything she needed here: solitude and purpose, and a connection to something far older than pack politics and breeding expectations. But there were still nights when loneliness crept in like frost, when she wondered what it might have been like to be wanted, to be valued for something other than her ability or inability to produce heirs. The snap of a branch shattered her reverie, and Ilara's head whipped toward the sound, her wolf surging alert beneath her skin. She could sense them now, multiple presences moving through the forest with the coordinated precision of trained warriors, their scents carrying the unmistakable markers of pack wolves, strong and well-fed, and utterly out of place in these wild lands. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she dropped the flowers and pressed herself against the rough bark of an oak, reaching for the concealment that the forest sometimes granted her, willing the shadows to deepen around her form. But these wolves were hunting with purpose, and she watched with growing dread as they spread out in a perfect search pattern, their eyes glowing amber in the dappled light as they methodically covered every inch of ground. The leader emerged from behind a stand of silver birch, a massive male with military bearing, and the 3 claw scars on his right shoulder that marked him as part of the king's guard, the elite warriors who served directly under Alpha King Kale Nightborn himself. Ilara's blood turned to ice in her veins at the recognition, because if the king's guard was here, hunting in these abandoned territories, then something had gone terribly wrong in the wider world of pack politics. The warrior's nostrils flared as he scented the air, his gaze sweeping across the glen with methodical precision, and then his eyes locked directly onto her hiding spot with uncertainty that made her wolf whimper in the back of her mind. He raised one hand in a signal, and the other guards converged on her position with frightening speed, forming a loose circle that cut off every avenue of escape before she could even consider running. The leader stepped forward, his expression carefully neutral, but his posture radiating the kind of authority that came from years of command. His voice, when he spoke, was surprisingly gentle, given the intimidating display of force surrounding her, carrying a note of something that might have been respect or perhaps merely professional courtesy. He told her that they meant her no harm, that they had been searching for weeks for someone with her particular gifts, that the Alpha King himself required the services of a healer with abilities beyond the conventional, someone who could work with the old magic that most modern wolves had forgotten or forsaken. Ilara's mind raced as she tried to process his words, tried to understand why the most powerful alpha in the entire continent would send his personal guard into the wilderness to find someone like her, a banished outcast with no name and no standing in any recognized pack structure. She demanded to know what kind of illness could possibly require such desperate measures. What could afflict someone as powerful as Cale Nightborn that his own court healers couldn't address? But the guard's expression closed off immediately, his lips pressing into a thin line that suggested he'd been ordered to reveal nothing of substance. He simply repeated that she needed to come with them, that the matter was urgent beyond measure, that her cooperation would be greatly appreciated and rewarded, though the underlying steel in his tone made it clear that cooperation was not truly optional. When she tried to back away, tried to call upon the forest to aid her as it had so many times before, she found her power suddenly muted, dampened by something the guards had brought with them, some kind of suppression magic woven into the very air around their formation. Before this story continues, if you're enjoying these twists and revelations, make sure to hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what you think is really wrong with the Alpha King. Your engagement helps stories like this reach more supernatural romance fans, so subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on notifications because this tale is about to get even more intense. They bound her wrists with silver-threaded rope that burned against her skin, but didn't fully suppress her abilities. Perhaps because they genuinely needed her functional, or perhaps because even the King's Guard recognized that completely neutralizing a wolf went against the ancient laws that governed their kind. The journey to the capital took 2 days of hard travel, moving through territories that Ilara recognized from old maps and older stories, crossing boundaries that had been drawn and redrawn a dozen times as packs rose and fell, and the Nightborn dynasty expanded its influence across the continent. She saw the evidence of Cale's rule everywhere they went, in the well-maintained roads and the prosperous-looking villages, in the guard posts that stood watch at regular intervals, and the merchants who traveled without apparent fear of rogue attacks. And she had to admit that whatever else might be true about the Alpha King, his lands seemed peaceful and well-ordered in ways that her old pack's territory had never managed. The palace rose before them on the third morning, a sprawling structure of dark stone and soaring towers that seemed to grow directly from the mountainside, its architecture blending seamlessly with the natural rock formations in a way that spoke of magic and engineering working in concert. Ilara had never seen anything like it, had never imagined that wolves could build something so magnificent, and despite her fear and resentment at being taken prisoner, she felt a reluctant awe stirring in her chest as they passed through gates carved with intricate scenes of wolf history. The guards led her through corridors that seemed to wind endlessly through the heart of the mountain, past rooms filled with finery she couldn't begin to price, until finally they stopped before an ornate door, guarded by 2 more warriors whose scents carried the same elite markers as her captors. The door opened to reveal a chamber that was part sick room and part royal suite, its walls hung with rich tapestries that couldn't quite mask the underlying smell of illness and slowly dying magic. Medical equipment that Ilara recognized from her healing work stood alongside instruments she'd never seen before, crystals that pulsed with faint light, and containers filled with substances that made her nose wrinkle with their acrid, unnatural scents. But it was the figure in the massive bed that commanded her attention, drew her gaze with an almost magnetic force that made her wolf surge forward with unprecedented intensity. A male so perfectly formed that even weakened by illness, he radiated an aura of power that pressed against her senses like a physical weight. Cale Nightborn looked nothing like she'd imagined from the stories she'd heard whispered in her old pack. Tales of a brutal warrior king who'd consolidated power through strength and strategic marriages, who ruled with an iron fist and showed mercy only when it served his political interests. The man before her was younger than she'd expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with features that were severe and aristocratic, but not cruel. his dark hair falling across a forehead beaded with sweat that spoke of fever or pain or both. His eyes opened as she entered, and the world seemed to tilt sideways as their gazes met, as something vast and terrifying and utterly inevitable slammed into place between them with the force of destiny itself. The mating bond erupted through every nerve in Alara's body, a cascade of sensation, an emotion, and bone-deep recognition that left her gasping for breath, her knees nearly buckling as her wolf howled with joy and terror in equal measure. She could feel him in ways that defied explanation, could sense the slow poison of whatever curse or illness racked his powerful frame, could taste the mixture of strength and vulnerability that defined his essence. And beneath it all was the unmistakable pull of two souls that had been searching for each other across time and distance and impossible circumstances. His eyes widened with the same recognition, the same shock that must be written across her own features, and for a long moment they simply stared at each other while the air between them seemed to crackle with unleashed potential. But recognition brought with it a flood of memories that shattered the fragile moment of connection, images rising unbidden from the depths of Alara's mind, where she'd tried to bury them beneath years of survival and solitude. She saw her grandmother's face, wise and weathered and smiling as she taught a young Alara about the old ways, about the responsibility that came with being born to the guardian bloodline, the ancient protectors who'd once served as the bridge between wolfkind and the deeper magics of the natural world. She saw the night everything changed, saw the soldiers wearing the Nightborn crest as they descended on her family's compound with silver weapons and absolute orders, saw her parents standing defiant even, as they were cut down, heard her grandmother's final spell as she used the last of her power to hide Alara away and curse the bloodline that had condemned them all. The decree had come from this palace, from the court of the previous Alpha King, with the full support and signature of his son and heir, the young Prince Kale, who'd been convinced by his advisors that the Moon Guardians represented a threat to the stability of the realm, that their ancient magic and their refusal to submit fully to royal authority made them dangerous relics of a bygone age that needed to be eliminated before they could foment rebellion. Alara had been only 12 when she'd watched her world burn, when she'd been smuggled out by loyal servants and passed from one sympathetic pack to another, until she'd finally found refuge in a small clan that had asked no questions about her past. She'd buried her heritage deep, suppressed the gifts that marked her as guardian-born, lived as quietly and unremarkably as possible until the day her supposed barrenness gave them an excuse to cast her out. And now, in the cruelest twist fate could devise, she stood before the man who'd signed her family's death warrant, the Alpha whose seal had authorized the systematic destruction of everything she'd loved, and her wolf was singing with the knowledge that he was hers, that the universe in its infinite wisdom or infinite cruelty had decided they were meant to be together. She could see in his eyes that he'd made the same connections, could watch the horror dawn across his features as he realized not just that she was his mate, but that she had every reason to hate him with the burning intensity of 1,000 suns. His mouth opened as if to speak, but Alara stepped backward, shaking her head violently as she fought against the bond that was trying to weave itself more tightly around her heart with every passing second. The words tumbled from her lips in a raw whisper that carried more weight than any shout, asking him if he knew what he'd done, if he had any idea how many families he'd destroyed, how many children had been left orphaned or killed outright in the purges that had swept through the guardian communities like wildfire. She watched his face pale further, watched something that might have been genuine remorse flicker in his eyes. But she was too angry and too hurt to care about his feelings, too consumed by the betrayal of her own body and wolf to show him any mercy. She told him that she would rather die than help him, that whatever curse or illness plagued him was probably justice finally catching up to his crimes, that he could rot in this bed for all she cared, because she owed him nothing but the same mercy he'd shown her people. The chamber erupted into chaos as guards moved to restrain her, as court officials who'd been lurking in the shadows rushed forward with protests and demands. But Kale's hand rose in a gesture that froze everyone in place despite the obvious tremor in his arm. His voice, when he finally spoke, was rougher than she'd expected, scraped raw by pain, and something that sounded almost like despair. He dismissed everyone from the room with an authority that brooked no argument, even from the advisors who clearly wanted to object, until only he and Alara remained in the sudden, heavy silence. He told her that she was right, that she had every reason to refuse him, that he'd lived with the guilt of what he'd done to the Guardians for years, but had convinced himself it was necessary, had believed the evidence his council had presented without question, because he'd been young and arrogant, and too certain of his own righteousness. He explained, his words coming in labored bursts as the curse clearly tightened its grip, that he'd discovered the truth only months ago when documents had surfaced from a dying court official's hidden archives, proof that his father's chief advisor Mordain had fabricated the entire conspiracy, had created false evidence of Guardian plots, because the Guardians had stumbled onto Mordain's own schemes to consolidate power and undermine the throne. By the time Cale realized he'd been manipulated into committing genocide against innocent people who'd only ever tried to serve the realm faithfully, the damage was done, the bloodlines scattered or destroyed, and his attempts to find survivors and make amends had yielded almost nothing. The curse that was killing him now was the final spell cast by the Guardian matriarch, Ilara's grandmother, a working of such power and precision that it had taken years to manifest but was now unraveling his life force, thread by thread, day by day, and every healer in the kingdom had confirmed that only someone of Guardian blood could possibly undo what Guardian magic had wrought. Ilara felt her rage waver in the face of his obvious sincerity, felt the bond tugging at her heart as it tried to make her feel his pain, his regret, his desperate desire not just to survive but to somehow atone for sins that could never truly be forgiven. But she hardened herself against the manipulation of biology and destiny, reminding herself that pretty words and guilt meant nothing if they didn't come with genuine change. That powerful men had been excusing their atrocities with claims of being misled or manipulated since the dawn of time. She asked him what he'd actually done to make amends besides feeling sorry for himself, what concrete actions he'd taken to help the survivors or punish those truly responsible, and watched his expression crumble into something raw and honest, as he admitted that Mordain still sat on his council, still wielded tremendous influence, because Cale hadn't yet found enough evidence to move against him openly without risking civil war among the nobles who'd profited from the Guardian purges. The admission hung between them like a blade, and Ilara felt something cold settle in her chest at the confirmation that even now, knowing the truth, this supposed Alpha King was more concerned with political stability than with justice for the murdered. She told him that he was still choosing the easy path, still prioritizing the comfort of the guilty over the rights of the dead and disappeared, and that she wanted nothing to do with him or his cursed bloodline or his convenient crisis of conscience. She turned to leave, fully expecting the guards to stop her. But to her shock, the door remained unbarred, and she realized, with a start, that Cale had truly meant what he said about not forcing her, that he was actually willing to let her walk away, even if it meant his certain death. What happens next will change everything. But before we continue, I need you to do me a favor. If you're invested in whether Ilara stays or leaves, if you want to see if Cale can truly redeem himself, smash that like button and leave a comment with your prediction. Should she save him or let fate run its course? Subscribe to make sure you catch every moment of this epic supernatural romance, because the tension is only going to build from here. She made it 3 steps down the corridor before her wolf rebelled completely, throwing itself against her control with a violence that sent her staggering against the stone wall, her vision blurring as the beast inside her howled its anguish at being separated from their mate. The bond was pulling tight enough to hurt now, a physical ache that radiated from her chest and made every breath feel insufficient, and Ilara realized with growing horror that leaving might actually kill her as surely as staying might destroy what remained of her principles. She slid down the wall, her bound hands clenched into fists as she fought against the tears that wanted to fall, against the terrible knowledge that fate had trapped her as thoroughly as any silver cage ever could. Hours passed in that corridor, guards watching her with expressions ranging from pity to confusion, until finally, woman approached with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged in these halls and feared no repercussions for speaking her mind. She introduced herself as Lisa, the court's master herbalist, and one of the few healers who'd been honest enough to tell Cale that conventional medicine couldn't help him. She settled onto the floor beside Alara, with a grace that spoke of extensive practice at making herself unthreatening, and her voice when she spoke carried none of the judgment or manipulation. Alara had been braced for. Lisa told her that she'd been with the court for 15 years, had watched Cale grow from an arrogant young prince into a ruler who genuinely tried to serve his people well, and that the discovery of what had been done to the Guardians had broken something fundamental in him, had shattered his certainty in his own judgment in ways that went far beyond simple political regret. She shared details that Cale apparently hadn't mentioned, spoke of how he'd been spending his remaining strength trying to track down every Guardian descendant he could find, offering them lands and titles and formal apologies backed by royal decree, though most had either fled beyond his reach or refused his overtures outright. She told Alara about the schools he'd started funding to preserve what knowledge of the old ways remained, about the laws he'd pushed through his council against fierce opposition that protected minority bloodlines from the kind of persecution the Guardians had suffered. Lisa was careful to note that none of this erased what had been done, that actions taken now couldn't bring back the dead or heal wounds that had festered for years. But she wanted Alara to understand that the man dying in that chamber wasn't the same person who'd signed those execution orders, that suffering and knowledge had changed him in fundamental ways. Alara listened, despite herself, feeling her certainty erode even as part of her raged against being swayed by second-hand accounts and carefully presented evidence of reform. She asked Lissa why she should believe any of it, why she should trust that this wasn't just an elaborate manipulation to secure her cooperation. And the herbalist's smile was sad but understanding as she explained that Alara didn't have to believe or trust anything, that she was free to walk away and let the cards fall where they would. But Lysa also pointed out that Alara had spent 3 years healing anyone who came to her in the forest, had never turned away a wounded rogue or dying traveler regardless of their past or their pack affiliations, and asked whether the man in that chamber deserved less compassion than the criminals and outcasts she'd saved without hesitation. The question hit harder than Alara wanted to admit, exposing the uncomfortable truth that her refusal to help Cale wasn't really about principle or justice, but about the specific, personal pain he'd caused her family. She was being given a choice that her parents and grandmother had never gotten, the opportunity to show mercy to an enemy who probably didn't deserve it. And wasn't that exactly what the Guardians had always stood for? The belief that healing and compassion were more powerful than vengeance and retribution. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. Lessons from childhood about how the old magic responded to the intentions of the wielder, how it flowed strongest through those who could see beyond their own suffering to the larger. Patterns of hurt and healing that connected all living things. She found herself back at Cale's door, without quite remembering the decision to return. Found her hands trembling as she pushed it open to reveal him exactly as she'd left him. Alone and fading, and somehow smaller than he'd seemed before. His eyes opened at her entrance, and the hope that flared in their depths was almost painful to witness, quickly suppressed as if he feared it would drive her away again. Alara crossed to the bedside with steps that felt both inevitable and terrifying, her healer's instincts already cataloging the symptoms she could see. The way his breathing was too shallow, and his skin had taken on an ashen quality that spoke of systems beginning to shut down. She told him that she would examine the curse, would see if her gifts could even touch what Guardian magic had wrought, but that her cooperation came with conditions that were non-negotiable. Her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. She laid out her terms with the precision of someone who'd spent long hours thinking about justice and restitution, even when she'd convinced herself she'd never get the chance to demand either. She wanted Mordain investigated immediately and publicly, wanted every scrap of evidence about his manipulation brought to light regardless of the political fallout, wanted him prosecuted to the fullest extent of wolf law if the proof supported the accusations. She wanted a formal royal decree declaring, "The Guardian purges a crime against the realm," wanted reparations established for survivors and their descendants, wanted lands and titles restored that had been stripped from her people. She wanted the history books rewritten to tell the truth about who the Guardians had been and what had been done to them, wanted schools and monuments erected in their memory, wanted their knowledge and traditions given the respect and protection they deserved. most importantly, she wanted Kale to understand that healing him did not mean forgiving him, that accepting the mating bond did not erase the past or obligate her to play the role of dutiful queen consort if he survived. She would save his life if she could, because that's what guardians did, because healing was in her nature and her blood, but he would have to earn anything beyond that through consistent action and genuine change, not just survive and expect her gratitude. Kyle listened to every word without interruption, his expression shifting through a dozen emotions too quick to catalog, and when she finally fell silent, he simply nodded his agreement, his voice barely above a whisper, as he swore on his bloodline and his throne that every condition would be met regardless of whether she succeeded in breaking the curse. Alara placed her hands on his chest, feeling the curse immediately like ice water spreading through her veins, a working of such elegant malice that she had to admire her grandmother's skill, even as she mourned the circumstances that had driven such a spell into being. The magic was woven directly into Kale's life force, designed to feed on his power and use it to strengthen the very bonds that were draining him. A perfect loop that would inevitably end in death, but would take months or years to complete, ensuring maximum suffering along the way. She could see the signature in the spell work, recognized her grandmother's distinctive style in the precise geometry of the curse's architecture, and felt tears sliding down her cheeks at this last message from a woman she'd loved and lost. This final protection that had ensured a guardian would eventually stand exactly where Alara stood now, with the power to choose mercy or vengeance. The curse pulsed under her touch, responding to her guardian blood with a kind of recognition, and Alara gasped as visions flooded her mind. Memories that weren't hers, but had been encoded into the spell itself, like a letter waiting to be delivered. She saw her grandmother in the moments before her death, saw the soldiers closing in, and the terrible choice being made. Saw the matriarch pouring the last of her power into a working that would span decades and guarantee that justice or mercy would eventually be served. But more than that, she saw her grandmother's hopes for what would come after, saw the old woman's belief that love could transform even the darkest legacy, that a guardian and a king united could heal more than just one cursed bloodline. Breaking the curse would require more than just her healing gift, Alara realized as she delved deeper into its structure, more than the herbal remedies and life force manipulation she'd mastered in the forest. It would require her to fully embrace her guardian heritage, to unlock the deeper wells of power that she'd kept suppressed since childhood, to perform a ritual that hadn't been done in generations and might kill her in the process, even if it succeeded in saving Kale. The ritual required absolute trust between the participants, required the mating bond to be fully accepted and consummated, required her to open herself completely to someone she had every reason to keep at arm's length. It was, she understood, her grandmother's final test, a challenge to see if she could be the guardian the world needed, rather than simply the survivor circumstances had forced her to become. She pulled back from Kale, her hands shaking as she processed everything she'd learned. Everything the curse had shown her. His eyes searched her face with desperate intensity, clearly reading some of what she'd discovered in her expression. And his voice was hoarse with more than just physical pain as he asked what she'd found. Alara told him the truth, explained the nature of the ritual and its requirements, watched his face pale further as he understood what she would be risking, what she would be giving up if she chose to save him. She saw him start to tell her not to do it, saw the words forming on his lips, but she pressed her fingers against his mouth to silence him before he could make the refusal she wouldn't be able to argue against. The truth was that she wanted to perform the ritual, wanted it with an intensity that terrified her, because somewhere in the hours of rage and resistance and reluctant understanding, she'd started to see Kale not just as the enemy who'd destroyed her past, but as a person capable of growth and change, as someone who'd been manipulated and had chosen to own his mistakes rather than hide behind them. She wanted to believe in the possibility her grandmother had seen, wanted to find out if love really could be stronger than inherited pain, wanted to give them both a chance at something that went beyond mere survival. But more than any of that, She wanted to honor what the Guardians had always stood for, the idea that healing was not weakness, and mercy was not surrender, that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was choose compassion, even when vengeance would be easier. Before we dive into the ritual that will change both their lives forever, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment telling me if you think Alara is making the right choice, or if she's letting herself be manipulated by the mating bond. Are you team forgiveness, or team make him suffer? Hit that like button if you're as emotionally invested in this as I am. And don't forget to subscribe because the next part is going to be absolutely explosive. Preparations for. The ritual took 3 days, time that Kyle used to make good on his promises even as his condition deteriorated visibly. Alara watched from the sidelines as he summoned his council and formally accused Mordain of treason, presenting the evidence that had been gathered over months of secret investigation, documents that painted a damning picture of manipulation and murder spanning decades. Mordain's protests and denials crumbled in the face of testimony from servants and minor officials who'd been too frightened to speak before, and Alara felt something loosen in her chest as she watched the architect of her family's destruction finally face consequences for his actions. The former advisor was stripped of title and lands and thrown into the deepest cells beneath the palace to await formal trial, and Kale immediately began the process of unwinding every policy and appointment Mordain had influenced. The formal decree about the Guardians was issued the next day, a document that Kale insisted Alara review and approve before it went to the royal scribes, and she found herself surprised by the rawness of its language, the way it didn't hide behind political euphemisms, but called the purges exactly what they were: genocide driven by lies and fear. The decree established reparations, returned confiscated lands, created protections for surviving Guardians and their descendants, and perhaps most importantly, acknowledged the throne's responsibility without caveat or excuse. Alara read it 3 times, searching for the loopholes and qualifications that powerful people always inserted to protect themselves, but found nothing except genuine accountability backed by royal authority. But it was the private moments that truly shifted something in her heart, the times when Kale thought she wasn't watching, and let his masks slip completely. She saw him break down in tears after reading letters from Guardian survivors, saw him take full responsibility in ways that clearly cost him tremendously, saw him sacrifice political capital and ally relationships to push through reforms that his council bitterly opposed. She saw him refuse pain medication because he believed he deserved to suffer for what he'd done, saw him draft personal apologies to families he'd destroyed, even though most would never be delivered, saw him reorganize his entire government to prevent the kind of concentrated power that had enabled Mordain's schemes. Lysa helped Alara prepare for the ritual, gathering the rare herbs and crystals that the old texts specified, creating the sacred space in a chamber deep in the mountain where natural magic pooled and eddied in patterns that reminded Alara achingly of her childhood home. The herbalist worked with quiet efficiency, but also with a gentleness that had become familiar over the past days, and as they arranged silver candles in complex geometric patterns, she shared stories about Kale that painted a more complete picture than Alara had allowed herself to see before. She learned about the king who checked on sick children in the middle of the night, who'd bankrupted the royal treasury 3 times over building hospitals and schools in poor districts, who personally investigated every report of official corruption, no matter how minor. The night before the ritual, Kale insisted on speaking with her alone, despite the obvious toll that even sitting up took on his failing body. He'd had documents drawn up, he explained with the kind of awkward formality that suggested he was nervous about her reaction, papers that would ensure her complete independence regardless of what happened during or after the ritual. If she chose to leave after healing him, she would have lands and wealth enough to build whatever life she wanted. No strings attached and no obligations to the throne or to him personally. If she chose to stay but didn't want to be his queen, he would respect that boundary and find ways to explain it to the court that protected her reputation. If she wanted to be his partner in ruling, he would share power genuinely, rather than just give her a ceremonial title, would ensure she had real authority to enact the changes she believed in. Alara stared at the documents, at the level of thought and care that had gone into protecting her agency and autonomy, and felt the last of her defenses crumble into dust. She told him that he was an idiot if he thought she was going through with the ritual just to leave. Afterward, that the mating bond was going to make separation physically painful, if not impossible, that she'd already made her choice even if it terrified her. His expression transformed into something incandescent, with hope and disbelief, and when she leaned in to kiss him for the first time, she felt the bond sing through every cell in her body, felt her wolf merge seamlessly with his, in a way that promised completion and belonging and home. The ritual began at midnight under a full moon that painted the chamber in silver light. Kale laid out on an altar of living stone, while Alara called upon powers she'd suppressed for so long they felt almost foreign returning to her command. She could feel her ancestors gathering in the spaces between heartbeats, could sense her grandmother's presence strongest of all, a warm approval that wrapped around her like a blanket as she began to chant in the old language that predated modern wolf speech. The curse fought her attempt to unravel it, fought with a ferocity that suggested it had been designed to resist even guardian magic. And Alara realized with a jolt of understanding that her grandmother had built in one final test, had ensured that only someone working from love rather than mere duty could successfully break the working. She poured everything she had into the ritual, channeling not just her healing gift, but the deeper magic of her bloodline, the power that connected guardians to the moon itself and to the primal forces that had shaped wolfkind in the ages before pacts and politics. Light erupted from her hands in cascading waves of silver and gold, wrapping around Kale's body and sinking into his skin, seeking out every thread of the curse and burning it away with purifying fire. She could feel his pain as if it were her own, could sense the moment when the curse began to truly break, and she pushed harder, even as exhaustion threatened to drag her under. The chamber filled with visions of the past, ghostly, images of guardians and kings working together in the old days, when the alliance had been strong and mutually beneficial, when her people had served as advisors and healers and bridges between the wolf packs and the wild magic of the world. Alara saw what had been lost when that partnership fractured, saw the mistakes on both sides that had led to mistrust and eventually to tragedy, and she understood that healing this wound went far beyond just saving one man's life. She was reweaving connections that had been severed for generations, was restoring a balance that the entire realm needed, even if they didn't know it yet. The curse shattered with a sound like breaking crystal, its fragments dissolving into mist that the moonlight quickly dispersed, and Alara collapsed across Kale's chest as the backlash of released magic rolled through her in waves. She could feel his heart beating strong and steady beneath her cheek, could sense his life force already beginning to restore itself now that it was no longer being drained, could hear his breathing evening out into the deep rhythm of natural sleep rather than the labored gasps of the dying. She'd done it, she realized through the haze of exhaustion, had broken a curse that every other healer in the kingdom had declared impossible, had saved the man fate had chosen as her mate, and in the process had begun healing wounds that went far deeper than magical ailments. When she woke, it was to find herself in Kale's arms, his eyes watching her with an expression of wonder and gratitude, and something deeper that made her breath catch in her throat. He told her that she was magnificent, that she'd given him not just his life back, but a reason to deserve it, that he would spend the rest of his days trying to be worthy of the mercy she'd shown him. Alara kissed him to stop the flow of words, kissed him with all the pent-up emotion and terror and hope that had been building in her chest, and felt the mating bond lock into place with a finality that was both terrifying and exactly right. Make sure you're subscribed because the epilogue is going to show you what happens when a guardian and a king truly unite, when love becomes the foundation for transforming an entire realm. Hit that like button if this ritual scene gave you chills, and drop a comment telling me what you want to see in their future. Your engagement makes all the difference, so don't skip this part. The months that followed were a whirlwind of change that reshaped the entire kingdom in ways both subtle and profound. Alara was crowned not as queen consort, but as high guardian, a title that hadn't existed in centuries, but that carried real power in the new governmental structure Kale implemented with her input. Together they established the Guardian Council, a body with authority equal to the noble houses, filled with representatives from every bloodline and magical tradition that had been marginalized or persecuted over the years. The old families protested at first, threatened to rebel against what they saw as a dilution of their power, but Kale faced them down with a steel that reminded everyone why he was called the Alpha King, making it clear that the days of unchecked noble privilege were over. Alara threw herself into the work of restoration, with a passion that surprised even her, traveling across the kingdom to find scattered Guardian descendants and offer them the choice to return or to receive support wherever they'd made new lives. She rebuilt the ancient Guardian sanctuaries, transforming them into schools where the old knowledge could be taught openly again, where young wolves with healing gifts or magical talents could learn their heritage without fear. She worked with Lissa to establish free healing clinics in every major city, ensuring that no one would be denied medical care because of status or wealth, creating a network of trained healers that drew on both modern techniques and ancient wisdom. But perhaps the greatest change was in Kyle himself, in the way he'd transformed from a ruler who governed through strength alone to one who understood that true power came from serving those under his protection. Alara watched him become the king she suspected he'd always had the potential to be, saw him make decisions that cost him politically but were right morally, saw him build genuine relationships with people he'd previously seen only as subjects. He sought her counsel on everything from minor policy disputes to major strategic decisions, valued her perspective not because she was his mate, but because she brought knowledge and experience that complemented his own. Their relationship deepened in ways that went far beyond the mating bond, built on shared purpose and mutual respect, and a love that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger. They argued sometimes, disagreed on approach and tactics and priorities, but they'd learned to navigate conflict with honesty and compromise, to see their differences as strengths rather than weaknesses. Kyle had kept his promise about sharing power genuinely, had restructured the government so that Alara had real authority over matters of healing, education, and magical oversight, had made it clear to the court that disrespecting her was the same as disrespecting him. The discovery that Alara was pregnant came as a shock to everyone, especially given her history of supposed barrenness. But she understood what had happened in ways the court healers couldn't quite grasp. Her body had been protecting her guardian powers all those years, had refused to create life while she was suppressed and hunted and unable to access her full heritage. Now, united with her mate and fully embraced in her power, her wolf had deemed the time right, and the twins growing within her carried both nightborn strength and guardian magic in equal measure, a perfect symbol of the new era they were building. The birth was attended by both traditional pack midwives and guardian healers, a blending of practices that would have been unthinkable just a year before. And when Alara held her son and daughter for the first time, she felt the weight of the future settling onto their tiny shoulders, even as she marveled at their perfection. They would grow up in a world she and Kyle were building together, a realm where power came with responsibility, and different bloodlines worked together rather than fighting for dominance, where the mistakes of the past were remembered but not repeated. Kyle stood beside her, his hand gentle on her shoulder as he gazed at their children with an awe that made her heart swell, and she knew that the journey from enemies to partners to parents had transformed them both in fundamental ways. The kingdom they were leaving to these children would not be perfect, would still face challenges and conflicts, and the eternal struggle to balance justice with mercy. But it would be better than what had come before, built on a foundation of acknowledged mistakes and genuine efforts at redemption, rather than on comfortable lies and inherited prejudices. On the first anniversary of the ritual that had saved Kale's life and bound them together, Alara stood in the rebuilt Guardian Sanctuary and looked out over the assembled crowd. Hundreds of wolves from every corner of the kingdom who'd come to celebrate not just her survival, but the rebirth of a tradition that had nearly been lost. She saw Guardian descendants, reunited with their heritage, saw young healers learning spells that hadn't been taught in decades, saw noble families and common pack members mingling without the rigid hierarchies that had defined court life for centuries. She felt Kale's presence beside her as always, solid and supportive, and still sometimes awed that she'd chosen him despite everything. The future stretched before them, full of possibility and challenge, but Alara faced it without the fear and loneliness that had defined so much of her life. She'd been banished as worthless, had survived when she should have died, had found power in places the world had forgotten, and had chosen mercy when vengeance would have been justified. She'd saved not just a king, but a kingdom, had transformed herself from victim to healer to leader, and had proven that the greatest strength wasn't in domination, but in the courage to love, even when you'd been given every reason not to. She was no longer barren or broken or banished, but whole and powerful, and exactly where she was meant to be. A guardian returned to reclaim her heritage, and a queen building a better world for the children who would come after. Thank you so much for joining me on Alara and Kale's incredible journey, from enemies to soulmates, from tragedy to triumph. If you love this story of redemption and supernatural romance, make sure you've hit that like button and drop a comment telling me your favorite moment. Should I create more stories about second chancemates and cursed kingdoms? Let me know what you want to see next. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another epic tale of love, magic, and transformation. Until next time, may you find the courage to choose healing over hurt and love over fear.